Okay, the Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate, Part 3 today. I know we started this like 3 months ago, but we haven't had a lot of opportunities to get back to it. But this is good. We've been talking about Proverbs, and we started talking about violence, contention, strife, and this led us into the idea of judicial punishment, governments enacting punishment on individuals. And then really, before we got to all the passages in Proverbs about justice and judicial punishments, I thought that it'd be good to analyze that question: how far are governments allowed by God to do this kind of thing? What kind of, where have they gone too far, and where is it in their right to enact laws in this area? And we talked about that principle, which brings us to that doctrine of the lesser magistrate. The principle is that God has given all power that exists, all authority, right, is from God. And so a government only has authority in its proper place, as God allows it to. It might try to steal authority, but it's not right for it to do so. This is clear. We ought to obey God rather than man. If a government tells you not to do what God has told you to do, you say no to the government because the government doesn't have the authority to do that, right? And there's really the basic principle. If the government tells me I need to turn in the Jews that are hiding in my attic, I say, you don't need to know about the Jews hiding in my attic. Yeah, right. What Jews, right? Because that's clearly outside of the bounds of their authority. So there's an obvious abuse of power, trying to grab power that's not given to the government, that governments tried to do. And it is right for lower authorities, even maybe local magistrates, to resist federal magistrates that try to take authority that doesn't belong to them. We've seen that in our own country. This is actually something that's happened in our own country. It's something that has happened throughout history, where great empires or large governments will enact laws, and lower, even towns and cities will say, no, we resist this. This is against your order, your authority given to you by God. And this was the cry of the Reformation, because the Reformation, by necessity, had to rebel not just against a church that had no longer preserved the gospel and truth, but also because the church was connected with the government, they had to rebel against the government. And so the reformers said, well, this is what we have to do, because to obey God is to disobey this government. So they formed their own governments. They didn't really form their own governments. The government of Germany rebelled against the Church of Rome as a government, and the government of Switzerland, and so on and so forth. The rebellion of the government of England was somewhat less holy, but they rebelled as well. And there you get the Church of England and all that. But anyway, that's a lot of historical stuff there. But at any rate, so this is what we're talking about. So what I wanted to do today is get to the law of God, and we're going to look at some of the categories of the law of God that were given to the people of Israel, and say, how do these categories inform us on what God has authorized governments to do? Now, really, we're going to go a little deeper than the general categories, but you could say that there are three general categories to the law of God. There is civil laws, and those are going to be the most informative for us today, because if God has created a perfect government in Israel, and in that government there were civil laws, then since we're really dealing with civil laws in our governments today, there's going to be a good, okay, if God authorized them to do this kind of civil thing, then obviously this is something God has for all governments. There's going to also be ceremonial laws to the people of Israel. We can learn something about God even from ceremonial laws, but we don't necessarily expect for ceremonies like you have to worship every on the 7th month, you have to have the Feast of Tabernacles, you need to have the Passover on the 1st month, and so on and so forth. We wouldn't expect that those would translate to Gentile nations. That was something specifically for Israel. And so we'll maybe have some conversation about that. So you have civil laws, and then you have ceremonial laws. You also have moral laws, which are just basic application of morality. And that seems like something that would translate. But there's also a question of, wait a minute, since this is a theocracy, there's moral laws because here's this direct authority under God. But can you really, how much of that can translate to governments today in the Gentile nations, where we can have morality legislated by the government? And so we're going to have to be more specific with those laws, because we're not talking about general categories then when we're talking about moral laws, but specific things that God says are moral. So there's going to be a whole, it's going to be a little brainy, but I don't think it's going to be that brainy that's hard to follow. But we are going to have to do some philosophy in our heads and think about how this works. The civil laws are going to be the easiest. So let's start. You can break down. I believe that this was given to the people of Israel here in Exodus 20, these 10 commandments, as a category of the law of God. Here's the categories. Number 1, you can see in verse 3, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Number 2, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Number 3, this is verse 7. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Verse 12, number 5. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Number 6, verse 13, thou shalt not kill. Number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. Number 8, thou shalt not steal. Number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And number 10, verse 17, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. So these are categorical. These are categories. These are general categories of the laws. Now I already gave you categories, but those are different applications. So, for instance, a law like thou shalt not murder is certainly a moral law, but it's going to have civil application. There's going to be some civil applications to that law, that moral principle. And so the civil application of the moral law is often what we want to focus on. Here's an area that the government certainly has the purview to enact this prevention of murder, right? And that's going to by the way, that's going to be extended, that prevention of murder, to women with children in their womb, in the law of God. I don't think we'll get there today, but we'll get there eventually. So what we have then is categories that you're going to find in the law of God, some moral, some civil laws in that category, and some of them are going to even contain ceremonial laws. For instance, thou shalt the first 4, right? No other gods before me, no graven images. These are going to be applied in ceremonies as well as in civil laws, and of course, it's a moral law as well. So we have 10 categories that are going to be in 3 different ways. As you look at all the laws, it's kind of complicated. But here's a really simple way to look at it. The first 4 laws are about our relationship with God. And you could summarize them as Jesus did. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy soul, with all thy might. And then the last 6 are about our relationship with others. And you could summarize them as Jesus did, and thy neighbor as thyself. That's the second. And all the commandments hang on these 2, he said. And so it's pretty obvious to see how a government is authorized by God to enforce the last 6, right? How we treat each other. Now, there's probably going to be some good discussion, I would hope, among us about how much is a government authorized by God to enforce the first 4. If they're a Gentile government. We're not a theocracy. But isn't it loving to your neighbor to call your neighbor to worship God? I mean, at what point where do we draw the line here? I have a thought that I'll share with you, but let's start with a couple different categories. Now here's not categories, but keep using that word category, and we're just going to have so many different things in our mind. Let me give you a couple of different types of laws that we find that give us some areas to discuss. The first one, I'm going to give you 2 of them, and that is worshiping God. Now, we already just saw that in Exodus 20. There's another law. You can look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. Of course, this is all throughout the first 5 books of the Bible, the command to worship God. Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5 is the Shema. The Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Now, notice the word Lord there is all caps. So, hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is one Yahweh. And thou shalt love Yahweh thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. There is a law. And that's, of course, one of the ones that Jesus pointed to as the greatest commandment. There is one God, and you are to worship God. So, this is interesting. Clearly, Israel had to worship God. At how much does this translate to nations today? How much of this are they authorized to enact? Well, our founding fathers in America felt that this was something that wasn't completely outside of the realm of government. Not that the government should be choosing which way to worship God. They certainly didn't think that the government should be telling people how to worship God. They wrote it into the Constitution that the government is not to respect an establishment of religion. It's not to take one establishment of religion and say that one's more respectable than this one. It's not to pick and choose, these are the right religions and that's the wrong one. Rather, if you read the writings of the founding fathers, you'll find that they were very religious, and they insisted that religion was absolutely essential to the government. That the government could not operate if the people weren't a religious people. I'm trying to remember the quote. Anyone remember the quote off the top of their head? I think it was George Washington, maybe. Or maybe it was Thomas. What's that? Might have been Benjamin Franklin. It's complete. They said that the Constitution is completely inadequate to govern a people without religion, because it is the morality of the citizenry that is very important to all the other citizens. I mean, the government's job is essentially to defend its citizens. That's foreign defense against other citizens who are going to harm you. That's the government's job, right? Well, if your citizenry is without religion, without faith in the one true God, then you have a big problem. So I think it is certainly within the purview of government to encourage and to promote religion, but not to choose one religion over another. Right? I think atheism should be against the government. I think the government should be against atheism, very much. And this sounds controversial today, but it was not for our founding fathers. The government was not designed to be atheist, and atheism was not a religion. It was the opposite of it, and therefore was the opposite of what should be promoted by the government. So then I think what we have is good reason, even though it's countercultural, good reason to think that there is some area in a government, if a government is doing right, for promotion of religion, just not prohibition of a religion, right? Hey, I think I think we should shut down our town on Sundays because people need to be encouraged to go to church. You're not allowed to have your business open on Sunday. If a government makes that law, and our governments have made, which is more recent that those have been abolished, but governments in many towns have done this, have made it outlawed to be open on Sunday. Why? Not to respect one establishment of a religion over another, but to say, you need to be religious. You need to go to church. You need to, there's nothing, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that is outside of the boundaries of what God has given a government to do, because it's clear that this is at least in line with the attitude of the government that God founded in Israel. So I think there's that. Let me add to that one more thing. Also, the education of the law. Now, this could be, you could see this in different ways. In Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 through 9, we're already there, so you might as well just stick there. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. Now, we're going to talk about the punishments for these crimes, right? These crimes that are given to you are to teach your children the law. Now, what happens if they don't teach their children the law? Nobody's coming into their house and taking them taking them to jail. This is a command of God without a direct punishment. The punishment will be the consequences if they don't, which they experience over and over again. And this is in general, with maybe a few exceptions. In general, this is also the same for the command to love the Lord with all your heart. Is there a punishment? You don't love the Lord enough? No, because the government really can't enforce that as a government, but it's still a command of God. So the government then has the right to encourage that loving God and to encourage its people, families, to teach their children about God, but it can't really enforce that. So there's your separation there. And so I think that seems very similar. You could also talk about how the government should be teaching its children about its own laws, And so you can see that in if you wanted to apply that to America. Hey, we should probably be teaching our children about the Constitution and about our founding fathers and things like that, Instead of teaching our children how terrible our land is because of, slavery or whatever, maybe, sure, we can teach all of our history, but let's also teach the good things, That
would make us accountable then.
Right. Yeah. We would have a much more enlightened generation if we did that. Before I move on, that's kind of one category. We're dealing with those laws about the love of God. In my opinion, I think there is something here for governments today. I think a government that encourages the love of God is good, though telling you how to worship God, I think is beyond the boundaries of government, because obviously governments are fallible and they can't enforce that correctly, and they will obviously overstretch their authority. But to encourage the love of God and to encourage family worship and to encourage religion, I think should be definitely part of it. It's definitely within the authority God has given the government. Any thoughts or conversation you want to have on that?
Yeah, and I just think that when they came over, they were escaping, being forced to worship. What was it, the Church of England or whatever, I don't know. And so that was, it's anathema. That's not the way to worship. Let us alone, so we could. They wouldn't be let alone. It was getting worse and worse, and so he came over here at great risk. So I guess when that law was put into, when they were coming up with it, that to me was in the forefront of their mind was, as you said, you can't, force everybody to do a government religion. Mm-hmm. And it gets warped, obviously. It's been warped here in the States, but
Yeah, we have to stay away from anything where absolute power or any kind of trust is left in the government to make the right decision. It's got to be the government subservient to the laws of God, not saying, well, I'm gonna decide what are the laws of God.
Yeah. Yes.
I think even the founding fathers from the Constitution had something to look back on too, because there's the whole issue of the Mayflower Compact, thing they wrote, and that first, I forgot the guy's name, was it Bradford or something like that?
I think it is. That sounds right, Bradford. Yeah.
That wrote how they were going to run that first town there, with Plymouth and everything. They all came up with that, the Pilgrims. When they came over, and that would have been, 150 years before.
Right.
Our country was really born out of the Revolution. The Reformation. The Reformation birthed the United States because of those ideas that came with the Reformation over, and you have the Plymouth and all of these colonies forming because they're trying to stay true to the scriptures. Yeah.
I think it's tricky, though, of how does the government encourage it without picking on? Because, like, you take the blue laws, which were, they were happening when I was a kid. I remember that. But in encouraging, let's say that, where, okay, you're not allowed to sell things on Sunday. Well, what does that do for your Seventh-day Adventists? That's not their day. Or the Jews. That's not their day. So you're kind of favoring one or over the other. Or what happened at the State House this Christmas, where people were offended that there was a nativity scene. So they're saying any religion is allowed to be practiced. So here comes the Satan worshippers to put up their thing, and it's like, yeah.
It is tricky. I think the ultimate thing we gotta, if we want to kind of keep our eyes on what we're trying to focus on, although we're going to go down rabbit trails, I'm sure that's what the discussion time is for. But I think the main thing that we should take away from this is that laws that encourage religion are not outside of the boundaries that God has given to governments. So encouraging religion is good. Now, how to do that? Yeah, that's tricky. Personally, I don't think that you can't just call anything a religion. You can't say, well, I'm sacrificing children. That's a religion. You got to let me do it. You can't do that. So in the same way, you can't just call atheism a religion. It's the exact opposite. Or Satanism, which is atheism. That's all Satanism is. They don't really believe in Satan. They don't really believe that he exists. They're actually just anti-religionists. So yeah, I think it's tricky, but it's also common sense. It's just in our modern society, it's like, well, they call themselves a religion. Well, just calling yourself a woman doesn't make you a woman, right? Calling yourself, right? So you can't just call yourself a religion and you're a religion. You'd have to prove that you actually are a religion, I would think. But at any rate, the point is, I think, still that whether or not you could debate how it should be enacted, the category of encouraging laws that encourage religion without choosing one, I think are still certainly valid as far as what God has authorized governments. Yes?
Why do you suppose they didn't just use the word morality
For what?
as opposed to religion? Or is that just because I live in a society where religion has so much connotation to it, negative connotation to it? Why not just replace that with morality? I mean, most people will agree with morality, right? Even though they may not live it, they may not obey it.
I would really push against the idea of replacing the word religion with morality, because morality is a concept of what is right and what is wrong, where religion is a practice of worshiping God. So practicing your faith and worshiping God is religion. There is a good religion, true religion, and there's bad religion. Bad religion is man-made religion. But religion in general, practicing faith in God, is something I think that should be encouraged. Morality is nothing without religion. What is morality? Well, it's whatever you make up, or whatever you decide is right or wrong, unless you have a religion to say, here's why it's right, here's why it's wrong. Yeah. It's more semantics, but Tim?
Morality is susceptible to change, depending on the whims of man. But
unless you have
the Bible,
yeah.
It cannot be changed.
Right, exactly. Unless you have that
that's the
foundation.
difference there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there will come a time when good shall be called evil and evil good.
Right. Everyone does that which is right in his own eyes.
Well, it already has changed.
Right. Now, true morality hasn't changed,
No, I agree.
but perception of morality does change. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? This is great. We could just spend the rest of the time talking. Actually, we have spent the rest of the time talking. All right. Well, let me just show you what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks, and then we'll wrap it up. So I made 12 of these different things. There's not really. This isn't necessarily exhaustive, but I'll just give them to you. The first two were in the Old Testament. We see laws about worship, laws about educating children about the law. We already covered those two just now. We also see protection of life and property, judicial equity, judicial process and integrity, which could almost be one. You could put those together. Family and sexual integrity, public health and safety, economic regulation, land and environmental stewardship, war and military conduct, punishment, even the death penalty, and immigration and treatment of foreigners. So these are all different things that you'll find. But you say, well, that just means the government can do anything in those categories that they want. No. Let's talk about what it actually says about those things. You say, well, he said environmental. That's not right. Most laws today about I would be very against. But there are some things that are actually in the Old Testament law to the Jews that I think are good. And it would actually be very positive things. And most of them we have times a million in our country today. We have gone way beyond. So the question is, how much of this is something that is right and appropriate, and where do you cross that line and now it's overreach? I think a lot of these areas we are now in overreach territory. Some of them we're just underreach, right? I think we are in underreach when it comes to promoting families and promoting religion. Because our government's so afraid, I don't want to be looked at as, I think the government should, I think when the government does enact a law that encourages people to get married, that encourages them to have children, that encourages church attendance, and that tax deductions for churches and things like that. Those types of laws, they could be abused, sure, but those kinds of laws are the kinds of things that we'd have way too little of, I think, and that God has authorized governments to do. So, any last thoughts before we close for today? Yes, Lou?
So when you talked about the religion and how atheism isn't, Satanism isn't, how is the government going to be able to decipher and be able to say this isn't?
How do they define it?
Now you're leaving it up to the government to make that decision as far as what to put on the state lawn on Christmas.
Well, so
these are an interesting question to have, right? Because one day Christ will return, and we're going to be reigning with him over nations. Some of them are not. Some of them, as we go into the millennial kingdom, will not all be believers in God, but they will be forced to follow his law. So for us as future rulers with Christ to be discussing these things is a good thing for us to discuss, right? We're going to be enacting them one day. So how much of this? I would say that there's a principle, like if a government were pure and righteous and there was no question about whether or not the people would ever take it wrongly and abuse that power, for them to force correct worship of the true God is perfectly fine. But you give that kind of power to a government knowing that people aren't perfect and they do corrupt, then you say, okay, this is going to easily become overreach, right? So how a government encourages worship of the true God is really the question. If they are encouraging the worship of the true God, I'd say they're in line with Scripture. But how much power do you want the government to have to enact that? Because won't that corrupt them and they use it wrongly? And so I think that's a real question that we could ask ourselves. But if they are using it rightly, I don't think they're overreaching. If they're using it wrongly, then they're overreaching. Because whether or not they believe, whether or not the society agrees with this, whether or not you could ever enact these laws in a democratic republic like ours that would never go for it, doesn't mean that it would be wrong to enact laws to say you must worship the one true living God. That wouldn't be a wrong law to have. It just would be dangerous in a society where it could be abused, right? So we know that it's not a wrong law because God gave it to the people of Israel. And they also ended up corrupt.
The Pharisees, the ones that as was discussed this morning. So
Right.
So if you leave it up to your government officials to determine whether it's okay for a certain thing to be promoted.
Right. So
I understand what you're saying as far as.
I'm looking at it from a different perspective to make it easier. So from my perspective as a citizen, if the government enacts a law that is fine, in line with the scriptures, then I'm saying it's not overreach, I have no mandate to resist it. If they enact a law that is not fine, in line with scriptures, that is overreach, I have the right to resist that, or the responsibility to resist it. Now, how do you get the government to enact the right laws if you have this ability for them to enforce religion? That's where I say you don't enforce religion, you encourage it. And you encourage only actual religions. I think it would be fairly easy to define religion. I don't think it would be that complicated. I mean, we define a lot of things. Maybe I could spend some time thinking about what a good definition would be. But if you can show that a religion is really just calling itself a religion for the sake of getting that benefit of being called a religion, and it really is just anti-religion like Satanism, then I think you could pretty easily write a definition that would exclude that concept.
Yeah.
I think part of our problem too is that at this point we are looking at the need to go back for correction. Whereas if you correct this, if the government started to do something, and I think some of our religion problems have kind of occurred side by side with the definition of a charitable organization. That would have been the point for the people to speak up and say, no, what you're doing is wrong, and if they don't correct it, then they get voted out of office.
Mm-hmm.
But so much time now has passed that to be looking back saying, how do you fix this now? That's the hard part. It's fixing what you've already gone past.
Right.
Because once you've given it to them, it's hard to take it back.
Yeah.
The quote clawback that they try to do with some of the monies now, trying to claw back your government morality, and the way that the people have just been allowed to, both the people and the government, been allowed to run amok, so to speak.
Right.
It's hard to correct it.
Yeah, and it's true. Just the fact that we even would have this conversation. Can you imagine 200 years ago, 250 years ago, the founding fathers talking about whether Satanism was a religion? I mean, they would not even have this discussion. Everybody knows that that's not a religion. Right? Yeah.
But it certainly would not have been.
Look at the sale of witchcraft.
Well, they had Wiccans and witches and things like that, but everyone knew that wasn't a religion. I mean, that's just the anti-religion, Yes.
I just want to say, in terms of the difficulty, getting back, undoing some of those things. I was just reading yesterday that Alabama just got, they phase out their income tax, which is unheard of. So there's hope for the impossible. That the Lord, the way we are now, it feels like there seems to be a possibility. Who knows?
Yeah.
Takes a bold, brave step.
Yeah, if you look at our study here and say, how do we fix our government, then you're going to be probably pretty depressed. But if you look at it and say, where is our government beyond its boundaries, and I have the right by God to resist them, that's really kind of what we're, the angle where we have something to do, And I'm for being active in government. I met on Thursday with a bunch of representatives from our state house. I tried to encourage them, prayed for them, all that kind of stuff. It was a group of us pastors. So I'm all for being active in government. That's really not the focus of this study. It's not how do we fix our government. Though I'm sure I don't at all I know that's the rabbit trail we're going to go down, and that's good. That's a good discussion to have. But because that's uncertain, I want to give you some certain things. And the certain things I think we have are these kind of laws that promote right religion are not outside of the boundary of, it's not like, oh, that's wrong because you're promoting right religion. That's not something outside of the boundaries that God has given to governments. That's not a place where we resist governments. We resist them. We'll get to those places where we resist them. You have a lot of that. Okay, anyone else before we close? Okay. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for the good discussion. Thank you for the fellowship that we have here, and the really just wrestling with this concept, this idea about your law and your authority that you've given to governments. How much of it have you given? How should that be enacted? How should we respond when it's wrongly used? I pray that you give us wisdom in this, and also in the categories where you have given us, given the government the right to do certain things. Help us to find submission, and help us to be good citizens as often as we are able to in the government that you've given us, knowing that we are but pilgrims waiting for the return of Christ, where we will reign with him. In the meantime, help us to be as obedient as we can within your word to those authorities that you have placed over us. We pray these things in Jesus' name.